Buried in Darkness, by Marlowe. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The heavy scent of rain hung in the air as the train clattered along the tracks, its rhythmic hum a steady comfort to the passengers inside. The evening sky outside was cloaked in darkness, only the occasional flash of distant lightning illuminating the landscape for brief, fleeting moments. For most, it was just another quiet journey, but for the 6 strangers aboard this train, it was the beginning of something far more sinister. Each of them had received the same invitation. An elegant, cryptic letter handwritten in black ink on heavy parchment, promising an all-expenses-paid stay at the secluded and grandiose Blackwood Manor. The invitation was personalized to each individual, though none of them knew who had sent it. No details, no explanations, only an address and the simple line, "Come and discover what has been waiting for you." The strange pull of curiosity and the allure of mystery had brought them together, albeit unknowingly. None of them knew the others, and each had boarded the train from different cities, none having any reason to suspect that this invitation would be the key that bound their fates. The first to speak was a woman in her early 30s, tall with jet black hair and a face too still for the brief glimmer of emotion that flashed in her pale eyes. She sat across from a man with a weathered face, a thick beard and deep-set eyes that betrayed years of quiet reflection. He had a way about him, something sharp, a quiet intensity that made Sarah uneasy. "Do you think we're the only ones?" Sarah asked, her voice soft, though the weight of her words hung in the air. Charles didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the view outside the window. The rain had intensified, turning the world outside into a blur of streaked gray. It made him uneasy. Everything felt off. No one invited us here by mistake, he thought. But why? "We're not the only ones," he replied after a long pause, his voice rough and low. "There are 5 others. All strangers." Sarah nodded slowly. "But why us?" Charles shrugged. "Who knows? We'll find out soon enough." The train sped forward, hurtling toward its unknown destination. As the minutes passed, others began to stir, a collection of individuals with backgrounds as varied as their personalities. A man in his 40s, dressed in a crisp suit, sat across from a young woman in a loose, casual outfit, her face half hidden behind a large book she'd been reading since the moment she boarded. Her name was Evelyn, a quiet soul with a sharp mind, someone who preferred to remain distant, lost in her own world. Next to her sat a thin, middle-aged man, Andrew, who hadn't said much, his eyes scanning the passengers with a peculiar, calculating gaze. At the back of the train car, a nervous young man named David shuffled through a stack of papers, seemingly obsessed with the strange details that had been included in his invitation. He had no idea why he had been chosen, but something in the fine print tugged at his mind, something that unsettled him though he couldn't quite place it. As they neared their destination, the train slowed, its whistle piercing the silence of the night. The announcement came through the speakers, clear and crisp. "Next stop, Blackwood Manor." The air seemed to thicken, the atmosphere inside the train car growing heavy with the uncertainty that hung over them all. Sarah could feel the tension in her bones, the quiet dread that had settled into the pit of her stomach. She wasn't sure what she expected, but the reality of what was about to unfold felt wrong, unnervingly wrong. "Looks like we're here," Charles said, his voice breaking the silence. He stood up, the floor beneath him creaking as if the train itself was reluctant to move. The others began to gather their things in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, unaware of the impending terror that awaited them. The train screeched to a halt at a dark, isolated platform. No lights, no signs, just the flickering glow of a distant lantern swinging in the wind. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. They disembarked, stepping onto the platform and gathering beneath the dim lanterns, their eyes darting nervously toward the path ahead. A figure emerged from the mist. A tall, gaunt man in a dark suit with a solemn expression. He didn't introduce himself, nor did he explain why they were there. He simply gestured toward the path leading through the fog and toward Blackwood Manor, looming in the distance. Its silhouette seemed unnatural, a shadow that stretched across the land, towering over the ground beneath it. As they neared their destination, the train slowed, its whistle piercing the silence of the night. The announcement came through the speakers, clear and crisp. "Next stop, Blackwood Manor." The air seemed to thicken, the atmosphere inside the train car growing heavy with the uncertainty that hung over them all. Sarah could feel the tension in her bones, the quiet dread that had settled into the pit of her stomach. She wasn't sure what she expected, but the reality of what was about to unfold felt wrong, unnervingly wrong. "Looks like we're here," Charles said, his voice breaking the silence. He stood up, the floor beneath him creaking as if the train itself was reluctant to move. The others began to gather their things in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, unaware of the impending terror that awaited them. The train screeched to a halt at a dark, isolated platform. No lights, no signs, just the flickering glow of a distant lantern swinging in the wind. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. They disembarked, stepping onto the platform and gathering beneath the dim lanterns, their eyes darting nervously toward the path ahead. A figure emerged from the mist. A tall, gaunt man in a dark suit with a solemn expression. He didn't introduce himself, nor did he explain why they were there. He simply gestured toward the path leading through the fog and toward Blackwood Manor, looming in the distance. Its silhouette seemed unnatural, a shadow that stretched across the land, towering over the ground beneath it. Chapter 2: The Mansion's Embrace. The heavy doors groaned closed behind them, sealing the group inside Blackwood Manor. The sudden silence that followed felt unnatural, suffocating. Not even the sound of rain or wind could be heard, as if the world outside had ceased to exist entirely. The air inside was thick, stale with the scent of old wood and dust, as though the mansion had been locked away for years, untouched by time or human hands. The stranger who had greeted them stood still, his hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed on the group. He was tall and thin, his face devoid of expression, but his presence was unnerving. He didn't speak. Instead, he simply gestured toward the darkened hallway that stretched before them. "Your rooms await," he repeated, his voice monotone, devoid of warmth. The group hesitated for a moment, exchanging nervous glances. The invitation had been strange enough, but now that they were here, the full weight of the situation pressed down on them. Why had they been chosen? What was this place? And more importantly, why did the mansion feel so alive? "Are we supposed to just follow him?" Evelyn whispered to Sarah, her voice barely audible in the thick, oppressive silence. Sarah gave a small, uncertain shrug, her unease growing with each passing second. "I guess we don't have much choice." With no other options, they moved forward, their footsteps echoing in the vast, dark hall. The mansion was cavernous, the high ceilings stretching impossibly upward, and the walls adorned with portraits of people whose faces seemed just a little too lifelike, their eyes following every movement. As they walked deeper into the manor, the temperature dropped. It wasn't cold in the conventional sense, but there was a chill that sank into their bones, an unnatural cold that seemed to creep from the very walls. Every so often, a faint breeze whispered through the narrow corridors, carrying with it the scent of something damp and decayed. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, turning and twisting in ways that made it hard to tell where they had come from or where they were going. The house had no logical structure. It was as if it had been built on the whims of a mad architect. Each turn seemed to take them further into the mansion's labyrinthine heart, yet they could not find a single window nor a trace of daylight. "I don't like this," David muttered, his voice shaking. "This place, it's wrong." The others nodded in uneasy agreement, but none of them dared to speak louder than a whisper, as if the very mansion itself might be listening. After what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at a set of large double doors, ancient and imposing, their surface covered in intricate carvings of twisted figures and symbols that none of them could decipher. The man in the dark suit opened the doors without a word and motioned for them to enter. Inside was a grand dining hall, the kind of room one might expect in a palace. A long, polished oak table sat at the center, covered in fine china and flickering candlelight. Yet despite the beauty of the setting, something felt off. The candles burned with an unnatural pale flame, casting strange shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The walls of the dining room were lined with shelves of books, many of them ancient, their leather-bound covers cracked and worn. The smell of mildew hung thick in the air. And at the far end of the room, a massive fireplace loomed, its hearth cold and empty. "Please take a seat," the stranger said, his voice still emotionless. He stood near the door, watching them carefully, his eyes scanning each of them in turn. Without speaking, they all slowly took their places at the long table, the strange unease in the air settling deeper into their skin. Sarah sat near the head of the table, across from Charles, who had already begun to scan the room with suspicion, his eyes darting from one corner to the next, searching for something he couldn't yet place. The rest of the group followed suit, each of them trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy despite the mounting sense of dread. Evelyn, still clutching her book, glanced nervously around the room, her gaze briefly settling on the portraits that adorned the walls. The figures in the paintings, though static, seemed to stare back at her with unervingly lifelike eyes. The silence was broken by the clink of fine china as the man in the dark suit placed a single goblet before each of them, filled with a dark ruby-red liquid. A rich, heady scent drifted from the goblets, sweet, but with an undertone of something metallic like copper. "We've prepared a meal for you," the stranger said, his eyes locked onto them, his gaze unblinking. "I trust you'll find it satisfactory." The group exchanged uncomfortable glances, but under the strange pressure of the moment, none of them questioned the man's words. They each picked up their goblets and without a word took a sip. The liquid was rich and smooth, with a taste that lingered far longer than it should have. Too sweet, too satisfying. The room grew even colder, if that was possible, and a feeling of heaviness settled over them. The tension was palpable, like the very air itself was charged with something unspoken. Charles was the first to set down his goblet, his hand shaking slightly as he placed it on the table. "This is wrong," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This whole thing, it feels wrong." Suddenly, a low, distant sound echoed from somewhere deep within the house. It was a soft creaking at first, followed by a rhythmic thudding, like something large and heavy was being dragged across the floor. It came from somewhere beyond the dining hall, somewhere deep inside the bowels of Blackwood Manor. Sarah stiffened, her pulse quickening. What was that? No one answered. The sound continued, growing louder, more distinct. The thudding grew into something more frantic, as though whatever was making it was drawing closer. Then, without warning, the doors to the dining hall slammed shut with a deafening bang. The group jumped to their feet, panic bubbling in their chests. "What the hell is going on?" Evelyn gasped, her eyes wide with terror. Before anyone could respond, the stranger's voice broke through the chaos, cold and calm. "It's already too late." Chapter 3. Echoes in the Dark. The doors to the dining hall remained shut, the heavy thud of them closing reverberating through the group like a death knell. The air inside the room felt suffocating now, colder than before, as if the house had inhaled their fear and was exhaling it back at them. Sarah's heart raced in her chest. She looked at the others, their faces pale, their eyes wide with growing panic. No one spoke, no one moved. The stranger's words echoed in her mind. "It's already too late." What did that mean? Evelyn's voice broke through the tense silence, shaky and afraid. "We need to get out of here. Now." David rushed toward the door, his hand slamming against the thick wood. "Let us out," he yelled. "Let us out." But there was no response. The walls of the room seemed to swallow his cries, the only sound now the pounding of his fist against the door, the rhythm of it unsettling and frantic. Sarah turned toward the stranger, hoping for some kind of explanation, but he stood motionless, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him. He hadn't moved an inch since the doors had closed. "What is happening?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper laced with dread. The man in the dark suit finally spoke, his voice calm, almost too calm for the terror that hung in the air. "The house is awake." The words sent a chill down her spine. "The house is awake." The sentence was cryptic, but it felt like the beginning of something far darker, something she didn't want to know. "What do you mean?" Charles demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. "What kind of sick joke is this? Why are we locked in here?" The stranger didn't answer at first. Instead, he motioned for them to sit back at the table. "You should sit. There is no running from what is coming." Evelyn looked at Sarah with a mix of terror and confusion. "Are we supposed to trust him?" she whispered, her eyes darting between the stranger and the others. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "But we don't have any choice." Reluctantly, they all returned to their seats, though none of them were calm. Each person sat rigid, unable to escape the sensation that something was closing in on them. The heavy silence pressed down like a weight, suffocating them. The walls felt like they were closing in, the room shrinking with every second. The stranger moved slowly, his gaze still fixed on them, but now there was something different about it. A hint of something darker. You must understand, he began, this place has a history. A long and bloody one. The walls you sit against, the floors you walk upon, have been witness to horrors that would drive any sane person to madness. Sarah swallowed hard, the taste of fear rising in her throat. What kind of horrors? She asked, her voice shaking. The man's eyes gleamed with something far too cold, too knowing. In this house the past is never truly gone. It lives in the shadows, in the cracks. It waits for the right moment to rise. Charles slammed his fist on the table. Enough with the riddles. What is this place? Why are we here? The stranger's eyes lingered on him for a moment, the corners of his mouth twitching in something like amusement. You are here because the house called you. Each of you carries something, some fragment of a past you've buried deep. The house knows this, and it will make you face what you've hidden. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words felt wrong, like they were scraping against the inside of her skull. The house called you. What did that mean? And what was it trying to make them face? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere in the house. The noise was followed by a guttural creak, like the groan of a massive wooden structure bending under pressure. Sarah jumped to her feet, heart racing. Did you hear that? She gasped. What was that? The stranger's face twisted in a grimace. It is the house. It is always watching, always listening. And it is not alone. A low rumble began to vibrate beneath their feet, growing louder with each passing second. The floor beneath them began to tremble, as if the mansion itself was coming alive. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed from the hallway outside the dining room. They weren't just any footsteps. They were slow, dragging, like something, or someone, was being forced to move. David stood frozen, staring at the door. Who's out there? He shouted. The stranger remained calm, unbothered. You will soon find out. Without warning, the sound stopped. The eerie silence returned and the tremors underfoot ceased. But the tension remained, like a fog that refused to lift. Sarah's mind raced. What kind of place was this? And why had they been brought here? The house itself seemed to pulse with something sinister, something that wasn't just old wood and stone. It was alive, hungry, waiting for them to make a mistake. Are we trapped here? Evelyn asked, her voice small and weak. The man in the dark suit nodded solemnly. You cannot leave until the house decides it is time. David shook his head, disbelief written across his face. No. This can't be happening. This isn't real. I assure you it is very real, the stranger said, his tone devoid of any empathy. The mansion feeds on fear. And your fear will bring it what it wants. The words were like a cold slap to the face. Sarah's stomach churned. She could feel the weight of them settling into her bones, making her limbs heavy, her heart race. What did the house want? What did it need? Before anyone could speak, a muffled scream echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion, a shrill cry of pure terror that reverberated through the walls. It was quickly silenced, as though someone, or something, had smothered it. All of them froze, the blood draining from their faces. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The stranger's eyes narrowed. The house calls for more. The words hung in the air, suffocating them as the darkness seemed to grow thicker around them, pressing in from all sides. The mansion was alive. And it was watching them. The truth was clear now. There was no escape. Chapter 4. The walls have eyes. The sound of the scream still echoed in Sarah's mind, a high-pitched wail that seemed to resonate deep within her chest, a vibration that wouldn't let go. The others were silent, their faces pale with fear, their bodies frozen in place. No one spoke. No one dared to move. The oppressive weight of the mansion's looming presence suffocated them. The stranger's gaze never wavered from the door, as though he expected something to burst through at any moment. The tension was unbearable, suffocating them in the stifling air. Each of them, though silent, was desperately trying to make sense of the impossible situation they were in. I can't stay here, Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the silence. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. We need to leave. This is madness. David stepped forward, his face taut with frustration. The doors are locked, remember? We're stuck here. Evelyn's hands trembled as she wiped at her face, eyes wide with panic. But we can't just sit here and do nothing. We need to figure out what's going on. We need answers. The stranger, still standing at the far end of the table, turned his gaze slowly toward her. The house will give you no answers, he said, his voice deep and cold. It is not here to explain. It is here to take. Sarah shuddered, her breath catching in her throat. There it was again, the dark undercurrent to his words. Something more sinister than just being trapped. The house was alive, but what did that truly mean? And what was it trying to take? A sudden crash from somewhere above them caused them all to flinch, heads snapping up toward the ceiling. Another scream followed, this one louder and more desperate. The sound was distorted, as though it was coming from far away, stretched out by the vastness of the house. Who's up there? Charles demanded, his voice rising with panic. Is someone else in this house? The stranger's eyes gleamed coldly, but he said nothing. Instead, he took a step closer to the table, his movements deliberate, slow. He was like a predator, circling its prey, making sure they felt the full weight of their situation. The house does not allow visitors, he said finally, his voice low as if savoring their fear. The ones you heard, they are already part of it. They have become part of it. Sarah's stomach churned, the walls of the room seeming to close in around her. What do you mean? What happened to them? They stayed too long, the stranger said, his gaze sweeping over them as if seeing through them. Like all of you, they were drawn in. And now they are trapped here like the rest of us. What do you mean, the rest of us? Evelyn asked, her voice sharp, more demanding now. You're not one of them, are you? Are you stuck here too? The stranger's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. I am not stuck, he said cryptically. I chose to stay. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. Why? Because the house chose me, he said, his eyes cold, empty. It chooses all of us in the end. Before anyone could respond, the faintest whisper of movement from the far corner of the room caught Sarah's attention. She turned quickly, her heart leaping into her throat. The wall, the very wall she had been leaning against, had shifted. A small seam had opened along the baseboard, barely noticeable at first. But as she stared, it widened, revealing a narrow, shadow-filled passageway. It was the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoing from within the dark crevice that sent a wave of nausea over her. Someone, or something, was moving within the walls. Did you see that? Sarah gasped, stepping back. David had already taken a step forward, his face a mixture of disbelief and confusion. What the hell is that? The stranger stood still, his expression unreadable. It's the house, he said simply. It hides its secrets in plain sight. The walls are not just walls here. They are alive. The words hung in the air like a bitter poison. Sarah felt the chill of dread claw at her insides, her breath coming in short gasps as she tried to steady herself. The walls alive? Her mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. The passageway was narrow, its dark entrance a gaping void that seemed to beckon them in as if someone, was waiting just beyond its reach. But no one moved. No one dared to. The whisper of footsteps grew louder, closer now, almost deafening in the stillness. The others were frozen, staring at the passage as if paralyzed by the fear of what was waiting inside. The walls felt too close, as though they were pressing in on them, closing them off from the world outside. Suddenly, the light above them flickered. The bulb buzzed once, twice, then went out with a sharp crack. The room plunged into darkness. Sarah gasped. Her heart pounded in her ears. She fumbled for the matches in her pocket, desperate to find a spark of light, but her hands trembled too violently. The darkness felt suffocating, like a physical presence pressing down on her. Stay calm, the stranger's voice cut through the chaos, low and steady. The house will test you. It will push you to your limits. But you must never stray from the light. I can't see anything, Evelyn cried out, her voice high-pitched, fraying at the edges. Sarah's fingers finally found the matchbox. She struck one, the flame sputtering to life just as the footsteps from within the walls reached a fever pitch, an unmistakable sound of scraping like claws against stone. With a sharp breath, Sarah lit the candle in her hand, the flickering light casting long shadows across the room. For a moment she thought she saw someone, in the corner of the room just out of reach of the light. A figure. Pale, gaunt. Their eyes glowed faintly, burning with an unnatural, hungry light. she gasped, stumbling backward, but the others had already seen it too. What is that? Charles whispered, his voice barely audible, trembling. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he motioned toward the passageway, now fully visible, dark and menacing. It has come for you, he said quietly. The house always comes for you. And with that, the figure in the corner moved, its slow, deliberate steps echoing through the room. Chapter 5. The Echoes of the Past. The air in the room grew colder. A heavy, oppressive silence descended, broken only by the faint echo of footsteps from the hidden passageway. Sarah's pulse raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the shadows in the corner seemed to stretch, pulling toward her like an inevitable force. She could almost feel the eyes of the figure, though she couldn't see its face. The candlelight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls, but no one moved. The figure, if it could even be called that, remained motionless, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness, locking onto them with an intensity that made Sarah's stomach twist in knots. She could hear the others breathing, quick and frantic, but there was no sound coming from the figure. It stood there, an unnatural stillness surrounding it, as if it were waiting. Charles, his face pale and his hands trembling, was the first to break the silence. What the hell is that thing? His voice cracked, a raw edge of fear in it that none of them had dared to voice until now. The stranger, who had remained eerily calm since the appearance of the figure, now took a slow step toward the group. His voice was deep, almost hypnotic as he answered, "It is what the house has become. A reflection of everything that has come before you and everything that will come after you." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her attempt to stay calm. "What does it want from us?" The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned slowly, walking toward the now visible passageway in the wall. The candlelight danced across the dark, narrow opening, casting strange shapes on the stone floor. "Come," he said. "You must understand it. You must see the house for what it truly is before it consumes you completely." Evelyn, who had been standing to the side with her hands pressed to her mouth, finally let out a sound of disbelief. "You want us to go in there? After that thing just appeared?" Her eyes were wide with terror, her breath shallow. "We have no choice," the stranger replied, his tone unyielding. "You cannot escape. You can only understand what the house is hiding and why it wants you." Sarah felt her body tense. She didn't want to go down that passage. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to leave, to find the nearest exit and never look back. But she had already realized, there was no way out. The doors were locked. There was no escape from the house. And worse still, it seemed the house had decided they were its next inhabitants. "No," Evelyn whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not going in there. I can't." But before she could finish, the room's temperature dropped even further. The shadows in the corner stirred once again, the figure now coming closer, slowly, almost gliding across the floor, its movements unnaturally smooth. Charles grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her toward the passageway with desperate force. "We have to go. Now." Sarah, frozen in place, could hear the scraping sound again, like something dragging across the floor from the darkness. She looked at the figure, its eyes glowing even brighter, and then turned back to the stranger, who was now standing just a few steps away from the passage. His face was unreadable, his features obscured by the flickering candlelight, but his presence was overpowering. "You won't survive if you stay here," he said softly, almost sadly. "The house will take you one by one, like it has taken so many others before you." There was no turning back now. Without another word, Sarah stepped toward the passageway, the others following reluctantly. The stranger did not move. His cold, emotionless gaze followed them as they entered the narrow corridor. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, the walls pressing in on them from both sides. The dim glow of Sarah's candle barely illuminated the first few steps ahead of her, but she kept moving forward, determined not to let her fear control her. The passage seemed to go on forever, winding its way through the bowels of the mansion. The further they went, the tighter the air became until it felt like they were suffocating, their lungs struggling to take in enough air. There was no sound, only the sound of their footsteps on the stone floor. But every now and then, just at the edge of their hearing, Sarah could swear she heard faint whispers. Murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They rounded a corner and Sarah's candlelight revealed something horrifying, a door. It was old and worn, its wooden surface scratched and marred by years of neglect. But what made Sarah's heart skip a beat wasn't the door itself. It was the shape carved into it. It was a symbol. One that looked strangely familiar. "Wait," David said, his voice a quiet rasp. He stepped forward, his gaze locked onto the door. "That symbol. I've seen it before." Sarah stared at it, her mind racing. It was an intricate design, something like a maze. But as she stared at it longer, she realized with a sudden, jarring clarity, it was the same symbol she had seen in the old family portraits when they first entered the mansion. The symbol had been hidden in the background, tucked away in the corners, almost unnoticeable. Now it was etched into the very fabric of the house. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against the cold wood of the door. A strange sensation washed over her, like an electric current running through her body. She yanked her hand back, feeling a sharp sting as though the wood had pricked her. "That's it," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to open it." "Do we?" Charles asked, his face pale. "Do we really want to know what's behind it?" Before anyone could respond, the door creaked. Slowly, agonizingly slow, it began to open. Something ancient and malevolent stirred behind it. Chapter 6. The Heart of Darkness. The door groaned as it slowly opened, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. It wasn't the comforting kind of darkness, the kind that could be pierced by the dim light of a candle. No, this was something else, deep and suffocating, as if the very air inside had been trapped for centuries, waiting for something to come and disturb its slumber. Sarah could feel the weight of that darkness pressing against her, tugging at the edges of her mind, urging her to step back. But there was no going back now. They had come too far, and the house wasn't done with them yet. "I don't like this," Evelyn murmured, her voice barely audible as she stood a few paces behind Sarah. The others were huddled together, a tight cluster of fear and uncertainty, staring at the door as if it might somehow come to life and swallow them whole. David, ever the skeptic, cleared his throat, though his hands were visibly shaking. "It's just a door. Just a room. Nothing more." He stepped forward, trying to sound braver than he felt. But Sarah knew better. She could sense it in the air, the thickening of the atmosphere. The house was alive, breathing with them. And whatever lay behind that door was the heart of it all. The source of the madness. With a shaky breath, Sarah stepped over the threshold. As she did, the temperature dropped so suddenly she felt like she had walked into an icebox. Her breath clouded in front of her, and she could hear the others behind her, whispering, hesitating, but none of them moving. They were all too afraid to go further. The room was vast, its edges swallowed by shadows. The candlelight barely illuminated anything. But as Sarah moved forward, she began to make out shapes. They were scattered throughout the room, old, tattered furniture covered in dust, broken mirrors reflecting nothing but the void. But what caught her eye was the centerpiece of the room. A large, ornate mirror, framed in dark wood, stood tall against the far wall. The glass was cracked, jagged lines running across its surface like veins of some long-dead creature. But what truly unsettled Sarah was the reflection she saw in it. Not her own. In the fractured mirror, a figure stood. Tall, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to blend into the shadows. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath the hood of a tattered cloak. And yet Sarah could feel its eyes on her, even though she couldn't see them. The figure did not move, did not speak. But its presence was undeniable. It was as if it had been waiting for her. Waiting for them all. Suddenly the air grew heavy again. The whispers, faint at first, grew louder, filling the room with a chorus of voices. They were unintelligible at first, a rush of foreign syllables and gasping breaths. But then, clear as day, Sarah heard one distinct word. "Leave." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice had come from the mirror. "Sarah," David called out softly from behind her, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here. Now." But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure in the mirror. It was like a magnet, pulling her closer, drawing her into the abyss. "Sarah, please," Evelyn begged, her voice a desperate whisper now. "Let's go. We're not supposed to be here." But it was too late. The figure's presence was overwhelming. Sarah felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and for a brief moment she thought it was one of the others. But when she turned, there was no one there. Just darkness, thick and pressing, surrounding them like a suffocating blanket. In that moment something shifted in the room. The whispers intensified, becoming urgent, frantic. She could hear them clearly now. "Leave now," The figure in the mirror began to move. It didn't walk. It didn't need to. It seemed to glide forward, its hooded face still hidden, but Sarah could feel it drawing closer. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to see. But her body betrayed her, her feet glued to the floor as she watched in horror. The figure's hand reached out from the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crack, sending shards flying in all directions. For a moment, Sarah thought she would be struck by the sharp fragments, but none of them came close. Instead, the figure stepped through the broken mirror. Its face was still hidden, but its presence was suffocating, as if the very air in the room had become thick with malice. "Get out!" Sarah screamed, but the words seemed to hang in the air, swallowed by the growing darkness. She turned, grabbing for the door they had come through, but the passage had disappeared. It was as if the room had shifted, closing them in. Panic surged through her. She slammed her palm against the stone wall, but it felt cold, unyielding. "There's no way out," she said, her voice trembling. She turned back to face the others. But there was something wrong. The others weren't there. In the span of a heartbeat they had disappeared. It was just her now, alone in the vast, suffocating room. The figure reached out again, its fingers long and skeletal, grasping for her. Sarah felt herself backing away, but there was nowhere to go. Suddenly the walls seemed to close in. The space around her compressed, the air thickening with an unbearable weight. The whispers grew louder, now filling her mind, drowning out everything else. "You will stay." The figure's voice echoed in her head, and in that instant Sarah understood. The house didn't want them to leave. The house wanted them to stay forever, to join the others who had wandered in and never returned. And Sarah was next. Chapter 7. The Price of Escape. The darkness clung to Sarah like a second skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, the frantic beats reverberating in her ears, drowning out everything else. The air felt thick, suffocating, the space around her closing in tighter with every breath she took. She stumbled backward, her eyes frantically searching for an escape that didn't exist. The figure had stepped fully into the room, its movement unnatural, gliding toward her with eerie precision. Its hood was still drawn low over its face, but Sarah could feel its eyes, cold, unblinking, burning through the fabric of its cloak. The air around her seemed to ripple with an ancient, malicious energy. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, this time clearer, as if it came not from the figure, but from inside her own mind. Sarah's knees buckled beneath her, but she caught herself on the edge of a table, her fingers clutching the cold wood as though it might somehow anchor her to reality. But the house was swallowing her whole, its dark presence pressing in on her from all sides. Her mind raced. There had to be a way out. She had to find a way to escape, to get away from whatever this thing was, whatever the house had become. The others, David, Evelyn, and the rest, had vanished into the shadows, leaving her alone with this thing. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive, not in the way she understood life. This thing, this entity, had existed in the darkness long before they ever set foot in the mansion. But how had they vanished? How had they just disappeared? "They are here," the voice coiled around her, slithering through her thoughts. "They are where they belong." She stumbled to her feet, driven by a surge of panic. There had to be an answer. If the house was alive, then surely there was something, some way to fight it, to break free of its grip. Why do you want us?" Sarah gasped, the words torn from her lips, her voice trembling with terror. The figure tilted its head, and for the first time she saw the faintest glimmer of something beneath the hood. A flash of eyes, hollow, black as night. The thing didn't speak, but somehow she felt its reply. "You are ours now. All of you. You are part of the house." The words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again, drowning her in a wave of hopelessness. She backed away, feeling the ground beneath her shift, the walls bending inward as if the house was alive, shaping itself around her. She couldn't breathe. The darkness pressed in harder, colder. It wasn't just the room closing in. It was the mansion itself, drawing its walls tighter, squeezing the life out of her. Her hands reached out, desperately searching for something, anything that could help her. She found a door, its wood ancient and worn, its hinges rusted. Without thinking, she yanked it open, hoping to find a way out. But all she found was another corridor, stretching impossibly long into the shadows. Oh, she couldn't go further. There was no escape. The house wouldn't let her leave. "You've been chosen." The voice was louder now, overwhelming, deafening, as if it was speaking directly in her mind. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She staggered backward, her hand clutching her chest, feeling her pulse thudding like a drumbeat, rapid and erratic. The figure was advancing slowly, its cloak swirling around its form like a gathering storm. The temperature in the room plummeted even further. There was no way out. No hope. The house had claimed them all one by one. And then, as if on cue, she saw it. Through the swirling shadows she saw a glimmer of light, a pale, flickering light at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A chance. Without thinking, Sarah ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to look back. She just ran, her footsteps echoing through the emptiness as she followed the pale light. The house seemed to shift around her, its walls stretching and twisting, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The light grew brighter with each step. It was a door, an exit maybe, or at least a way out of the nightmare. The door was old, its wood cracked and peeling, but the light beyond it beckoned her, offering a glimmer of hope. She reached the door and shoved it open, bursting through into a small, dimly lit room. It was a study, its walls lined with dusty bookshelves and old furniture. At first it seemed like a safe haven, a sanctuary from the horrors outside. But then the door slammed shut behind her. And she realized the room wasn't empty. The figures were there, standing in the corners of the room, their faces hidden in shadow. There were more of them now. The others. The ones who had vanished. David was standing in the corner, his eyes wide, his mouth hanging open in silent horror. Evelyn stood near the bookshelf, her hand resting against the spine of a book, but she didn't move. She didn't acknowledge Sarah. They were there, but they weren't really there. And then Sarah understood. The house had taken them. One by one it would take them all. She had tried to escape, but there was no escaping the mansion, no escaping the dark, oppressive force that had waited for them. It had lured them here, trapped them, and now it was pulling them deeper into its endless night. With a sudden, bone-chilling realization, Sarah knew what she had to do. To survive, to escape, she had to let go of everything. She had to let go of the others. She had to accept the truth. The mansion would never let them leave. It had claimed them all, and it was hungry for more. But as she turned, ready to face whatever came next, she saw it again. The figure. It had followed her into the room. And this time it wasn't hiding its face. Chapter 8. The Last Choice. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she locked eyes with the figure standing before her. This time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just a shadow in the dark. The figure had stepped fully into the dimly lit room, its face slowly coming into view. Hollow, blackened eyes stared back at her with an unearthly intensity. It was the same face she had seen in her nightmares, the same face that haunted her waking thoughts. But there was something new, something different. The figure was not just an entity anymore. It was something far more terrible, something that was once human. David's face flashed through her mind. Was this what had happened to him? Had he become one of them? Was it too late for any of them? You cannot fight what is already in you, the voice whispered from within the figure, but it wasn't just a voice anymore. It felt like it was crawling under her skin, scraping against her nerves, seeping into her very thoughts. Sarah staggered backward, her pulse quickening as she scanned the room, searching for an exit, some way out of the nightmare that had consumed them all. But the walls were closing in again, just like before, and the door she had just come through was now gone, as if it had never existed. The figure's lips parted, revealing a mouth too wide, too dark, filled with sharp, broken teeth that seemed to stretch on forever. A low, almost reverberating growl escaped from the depths of its throat, a sound that made the room shudder. "There is no escape," it said, its voice echoing in the chamber like the whispers of the dead. "You are already part of this place." The floor beneath Sarah's feet seemed to shift, and for a moment, the ground felt like it was dissolving beneath her. She teetered on the edge of the abyss, but she didn't fall. She couldn't fall. Not like this. Not when there was still a chance, however slim. Her eyes darted to the other figures in the room, David, Evelyn, and the others. They were still standing there, frozen, their eyes vacant, as though they had already accepted the fate that had been sealed for them. The mansion had taken them and they had surrendered to it, their bodies mere shells, their spirits long lost to the darkness. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up yet. She couldn't. Not without a fight. "You have to choose," the figure said, its voice dripping with something dark, something ancient. Your life or theirs. Sarah's heart slammed in her chest. The figure wasn't just talking about her survival. It was offering her a choice, a terrible, unforgiving choice. She could leave, but only at the cost of the others. Or she could stay, but the mansion would claim her soul as it had done with all the others. It was a choice between life and death, between freedom and damnation. You've always known the price, the figure hissed. The mansion does not let go so easily. And neither will you. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps. She could feel the pressure closing in on her. Her body, her mind, every part of her screamed for escape. But the walls of the mansion were alive, breathing, pressing in on her, waiting for her to make a decision. She had to act now or be consumed by the darkness. No, she shouted, though her voice trembled. I won't give up. I won't choose. The figure stepped forward, its shadow lengthening like a cloak over her, suffocating her with its presence. Then you will stay. The words were final, cruel, as if it had already decided her fate. The room seemed to distort, bending at impossible angles, as if the house itself was bending to the will of whatever had claimed it. The temperature plummeted, and Sarah felt the chill crawl beneath her skin, deeper than the cold air. It was as if she could feel the very walls of the mansion tightening around her chest, squeezing out the last vestiges of hope. But then something shifted. Something inside Sarah clicked, like a door opening in the dark recesses of her mind. She remembered the letter. The invitation that had brought them here. She remembered the strange sense of déjà vu, the sense that they had been led here for a reason. No, for a purpose. The mansion had wanted them. It had called to them. But why? Her eyes flickered to the others again. They were standing still, not alive, not dead, trapped in between. She could almost feel their presence inside the room with her, the weight of their souls pressing against the walls of her mind. They weren't gone. Not yet. They were still there, waiting to be freed. She couldn't leave them behind. Not now. I choose, she whispered, her voice thick with resolve. I choose to fight. The figure froze, its head tilting as though confused or perhaps intrigued. The shadow it cast seemed to waver for a moment, flickering like a dying flame. For the first time since she had entered this hellish mansion, Sarah felt a small flicker of control, a surge of power running through her veins. She was not powerless. She was not alone. The figure let out a soft, mocking laugh. You think you can stop it? It asked, its voice dripping with scorn. But Sarah's heart surged with something else. Something deeper. A burning desire to survive. To escape. To save the ones she could. She stepped forward, ignoring the cold, ignoring the crushing weight of the mansion's presence. I will stop you, she said more fiercely now. I will save them. And with that she lunged at the figure. The mansion trembled. Chapter 9. The Final Descent. Sarah's mind raced, her heartbeat a constant, deafening rhythm in her ears. As she lunged at the figure, everything seemed to slow, every movement heavy with dread, as though the mansion itself were watching. The dark figure before her twisted, its form flickering like a dying candle flame. It was not fully real. It was something far worse, an illusion of the nightmare they had all been trapped in. You cannot fight me, the voice sneered, but this time Sarah wasn't listening. She had crossed a line. No longer would she be a pawn in the mansion's cruel game. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was determined to destroy whatever this was, whatever had turned this house into a prison. The figure advanced on her, a swirl of shadow and malice, but Sarah didn't hesitate. She had come too far. Desperation fueled her every step. Her hand grasped for the small shard of broken glass she had found earlier, now sharpened into a makeshift weapon. With a scream, she thrust it forward, aiming for the heart of the shadow that was the figure. The glass pierced through the figure's chest, but instead of blood, a thick black smoke poured from the wound. The air itself seemed to twist, filled with the rancid smell of rot, and for a brief moment, Sarah could hear 1,000 whispers, all speaking at once, their voices overlapping like a cacophony of agony. And then everything exploded. The room around her fractured, the walls shaking with an unnatural violence. The mansion roared, a deep and guttural sound that reverberated through the floor, through the air, through her very bones. The shadows grew thicker, swallowing the light, twisting it into grotesque shapes as if the house itself was alive, suffocating, crushing, consuming. Sarah's legs buckled beneath her, the weight of the house's fury pressing down on her like an iron vice. She gasped for air, her body convulsing as she struggled to stay upright. The walls, once immovable, now shifted and warped, as though the house was trying to collapse in on itself. The paintings on the walls came alive, their eyes following her every movement, the faces contorting in pain. She fought to stay focused even as the room dissolved into chaos. She needed to keep going. There was no turning back. Through the darkness she saw it, the way out. It was there, beyond the swirling shadows at the end of the hallway. The front door of the mansion, just visible in the distance, its wooden frame illuminated by the faintest sliver of light. The other guests were still there, David, Evelyn, and the others, standing motionless as though they hadn't heard the eruption of destruction all around them. They were caught in the mansion's grip, their bodies suspended in time. Sarah's heart twisted. She couldn't leave them like this. She couldn't abandon them. But at that moment she knew that she had no choice. The mansion would consume everyone in its path unless she made it out. She had to escape. The others were beyond saving, lost in the twisted web the mansion had spun. She had to survive. With a roar, she pushed herself to her feet, her body shaking, her legs almost buckling beneath her. The ground seemed to ripple, shifting as though it had no intention of letting her leave. The walls of the mansion groaned, the very foundation threatening to crumble beneath her. "Leave now," a voice whispered in her ear. "Before it's too late." She didn't stop. She couldn't. Every instinct told her to keep moving, to run. The mansion would not be satisfied until it had claimed them all. But she wouldn't let it win. Not this time. She ran toward the door, her feet barely touching the ground. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows seemed to chase after her, hungry and relentless. But she was faster. She could feel the weight of the mansion lifting as she pushed herself forward, step by step, inch by inch. Finally she reached the door. Her hands trembled as she reached for the handle, her fingers cold and slick with sweat. She didn't hesitate. She wrenched the door open, and for a brief moment there was silence. The mansion trembled one final time, as though it were aware that it had lost. The shadows receded, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for Sarah to slip through the door and into the night. She didn't look back. She couldn't. As she stepped out into the cold, damp air, the mansion's monstrous groan echoed behind her, the house shuddering as though it were a dying beast. She knew that she had escaped, that the house would never claim her, but the terror would stay with her. The mansion's secrets, its horrors, would follow her for the rest of her life. But she had made it out. She had survived. Sarah took a deep breath and turned away, her body still shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. The mansion was behind her now, a crumbling relic of madness. It was over. For her. But she knew deep down that she would never forget the horrors of the house. That some things, once they enter your mind, never truly leave. The shadows would always be there, lurking, waiting. But now they were no longer inside her. And for the first time since entering Blackstone Mansion, she could finally breathe. Chapter 10. The House's Final Secret. The cold air was sharp as Sarah staggered away from Blackstone Mansion, her footsteps heavy and unsteady on the gravel path. Her lungs burned with every breath as though they were starving for air. Her body felt broken, each movement a painful reminder of the horrors she had just escaped. But as she walked, the sight of the mansion, distant now, shrouded in the thick fog that clung to the earth like a predator, remained fixed in her mind. She kept moving, one foot in front of the other, barely able to register the world around her. The night was so quiet now, the eerie silence almost more unsettling than the screams and cries of anguish that had echoed through the mansion's halls. She wanted to put it all behind her. She needed to forget. But the darkness, the fear would not let go. She had escaped, yes. But she knew deep down that the mansion's reach didn't end with her leaving its grounds. It was still there, lingering in the edges of her memory, twisting her thoughts into a labyrinth of fear. She could hear the whispers, faint but clear, as if the house itself was calling her back, beckoning her to return. "It's not over." She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. The voices grew louder, a cacophony of despair, of warning. She could feel the ground shift beneath her feet, as though it too were unsure whether she had truly escaped. Just then she stumbled. Her foot caught on something buried beneath the earth, something hard. Sarah froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Slowly, cautiously, she knelt to the ground, her hand brushing away the dirt and leaves. She uncovered a small, weathered box, its surface cracked with age. Her fingers trembled as she opened the box. Inside was a single yellowed piece of paper, its edges frayed and torn. It looked ancient, a relic from a time long past. With shaking hands she unfolded it. The paper was a map, hand-drawn, its ink faded but still legible. Her breath caught as she realized what it was. The map depicted the mansion, the same mansion she had just fled from, only this version was different. This was the mansion before the fire, before everything had been destroyed. But there was something on the map that made her blood run cold. Hidden beneath the mansion's foundation, beneath the very core of the house, was a dark room marked with a symbol she had seen before. It was the same symbol that had appeared in her dreams. The house was never finished. There was something beneath it, something that had been buried. And it was waiting. Her hands went clammy, the world tilting on its axis as realization sank in. The house hadn't simply been haunted. It was built on something much older, something far darker. A secret buried in the bowels of the earth, waiting for someone to unlock it. And that someone was her. Terror seized her chest. She closed her eyes, shaking her head violently, but the words from the map still lingered in her mind. She could feel it now, a pressure building deep inside her, like the house's malignant presence was closing in from all sides. Her survival, her escape, it had all been a lie. There was no escaping Blackstone Mansion. It wasn't done with her. It was never done with anyone. You'll never escape. The words echoed in her ears, a sinister whisper that slipped under her skin and burrowed into her soul. Her escape had been nothing more than an illusion. She looked up. The mansion loomed before her again, impossibly close. She hadn't moved at all. She hadn't gone anywhere. The mansion stood, silent and imposing, just as it had when she first arrived. The front doors were now wide open, welcoming her back as though they had always known she would return. The fog rolled over its cracked stone steps, tendrils of smoke rising from the ground like fingers reaching for her. The map slipped from her hand and fluttered to the ground. She tried to scream, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Her body froze as the shadows within the mansion's windows shifted, alive and watching. In the distance, beyond the mansion's broken walls, Sarah saw the faces of the others, standing in the windows like phantoms, their eyes hollow and desperate. They hadn't escaped. They were still trapped. And now she was too. The mansion was alive. It had never let go. It had always been waiting for the right person to awaken its final secret. And Sarah was that person. As the doors of Blackstone Mansion slowly closed behind her, a cold smile stretched across her face. She was home.